And good afternoon, everybody, particularly to the IRMSA members that we've got with us today and members from our global bodies that are joining us as well. It's really fantastic to have you here in Johannesburg on our little bit, it's a bit chilly today in South Africa, in Johannesburg, but we're having a bit of a cold front, so we're looking forward to our spring arriving very soon. But a warm welcome to everyone for joining us today, and particularly to our partners from our EFRIMA bodies where we are members of and sit on the board, the International Federation for Risk Management and Insurance Management Associations. So we are delighted to have people from all over the world joining us today. We are really excited to have such a session to really hear the stories and experiences from what we've been experiencing over the last few months. You know, in South Africa, we've had so many challenges and experiences, but felt across the world. And I must say that it's just wonderful to have our friends from overseas with us today. Normally, during the year, we have our FEMA meetings twice a year, and we were meant to be in the US at the beginning of May with RIMS, and all the FEMA members from all over the world. And of course, we couldn't be there with Mary Roth and her team. And then, of course, now shortly we were meant to be in Singapore with Parima, with Frank Baron from Parima in Singapore. And so a lot of disappointments, but sitting earlier now, just chatting and seeing the members from all over the world, it really felt a little bit like family coming together, which is, I think, how we've become over the last few years, and just such a pleasure to see your faces and hear the accents and the voices and the friends from all over the world. So thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. So this afternoon in Johannesburg, but I know different time zones are being experienced from our partners that are joining us from across the world. So thank you very much for being with us. I know we've got people coming in from a Parima, that from Hong Kong, Singapore, that side, right through Europe, the UK, and then of course in the USA as well, and in Canada. So thank you for being with us. And then of course, our beautiful South Africans and countries elsewhere in Africa as well. Thank you for being with us today. It is really a huge pleasure to have you all here. And before we get going, I really need to mention a huge thank you to LexisNexis for your sponsorship this afternoon and your continued support. We wouldn't be able to host such webinars without your support. So thank you very, very much. And then to our delegates that are joining us, thank you for being here this afternoon. If I can ask you just to keep in mind that the session has started and we will keep going until 16:30, until 4:30 p.m. South Africa time. And so it's going to be a fantastic 2.5 hours this afternoon. And of course, the entire session will be facilitated and hosted by Gert Kruiwagen, who is not only a very active IRMSA member, he's not only a fellow member, he's also a CRM prof. He's done all of our board exams, but really at the cream of the crop in terms of our designations, he is our fellow member. But of course, at the moment, he's also the president of EFRIMA. And so it was just so appropriate for him to be able to host the members from across the world today as our president of EFRIMA. So Gert, thank you very much for being here. But before I hand over to Gert, I'm just going to mention a few logistics. So if you want to ask questions or chat, please use the chat box available. And then at the end, there will be a panel facilitated by Gert with the various members, and we will be using the chat box there and using the questions and at the end. If you're following on social media, please use the hashtag live with IRMSA. And then something quite fun, I mean, we always use our social media hashtags. Whoever today has the most popular tweet or Facebook post, our communication specialist will be looking at them, and we will be giving to the most popular tweet a ticket to the IRMSA conference, which is coming up at the end of September. So that's the 30th of September, the 1st of October. Someone very lucky out there, whether they're in South Africa or elsewhere, will be able to connect. As most of you know, this year we will not be having an in-person conference due to COVID-19, and it will be a virtual event. But a very different virtual conference, a lot of fun. We're bringing in a bit of a gaming experience. We're going to be using the different streams. We'll be having 6 streams and plenary, that will be taking place with very, very different speakers, strong leaders, risk professionals, practitioners, different industries represented, and global speakers as well. So that'll be something to look forward to for all of you. But of course, that one lucky winner is going to walk away with that prize at the end of the day. So I'm quite excited to see who that will be. And then, of course, to our international guests joining us today from the various bodies, should you wish to attend our conference at the end of the month, please feel free to register and at the rate of an UMSA member. So we would like to open that to all of our partners that are participating today. And then, of course, there's going to be a survey. So if you can participate in the survey and just ask the questions to help our event team to plan events for going forward. So we've got our conference to look forward to. We have our awards coming up as well on the 13th of November, also going to be a virtual event. And looking at, really, I think there are going to be some amazing stories to share at our awards this year. We've seen risk professionals and organizations that have really thrived during this time and have really shown us what risk management is. So we're looking forward to our awards in November. But now I'd like to hand over to Gert Krevach, and as I said, he's the president of AFRIMA at the moment. And from there, we'll be handing over to our various speakers and we'll end with a panel session. So it's just been fantastic. We've got Julia Graham from AMEC. We've got Mary Roth, who's the CEO at RIMS, and our past president, Robert Cartwright of RIMS. We've got Frank Baron from PARIMA. And then in the panel, we've got our very own Berenice Francis, who's our past president, our immediate past president of UMSA. So I think today you're going to hear a wealth of experience, of just knowledge, the war stories over the last few months, and then most particularly what I'm going to find interesting is this way forward. What does this path look like for all of us? I'd just like to thank everyone for being so engaging in the last couple of weeks in putting content together from all over the world, and to Christopher Palmer, Chief Risk Advisor, for assisting as well, to our events team, and then also to Angela Cherrington today for assisting us from your hub with creating the platform for us to be able to work with our partners from across the world. So Gert, can I hand over to you now? I'm really looking forward to the session and hearing the stories from across the world. Gert, are you there? Can I hand over to you? Fantastic. Good afternoon, Gert, in your very, very interesting looking library. You know, after this, we've had quite a few meetings, Gert, and I need to tell you that when I can visit your house again after this pandemic, I'm going straight to this library to go and borrow a few books.
Good day, everybody. Thank you very much, firstly, for joining us and for allowing us in your living rooms, in your studies, and in your offices at home. Like most people around the world, we are all working from home, as you can see, so am I. Gillian, you're very welcome to come and visit me and have a look at the library. There's just one rule: no books are allowed to leave this library. Ladies and gentlemen, one of the privileges of being a member of UMSA and being a South African risk professional is the fact that we are able to interact with people from around the world and to learn from them. We get these influences from everybody. We are fortunate that we get the influences from the US, from Europe, from Asia, from Australia, etc. And we are able to utilize that and build on that and have the best from all of that to utilize what we do. And if you look at the professionalization programs that are available through UMSA, that's exactly what has been happening. We are really a family, all the risk professionals around the world. And the panelists that you see and that you will listen to this afternoon are all friends of long standing. You notice I don't say old friends because some of them are very young, but we friends of many years standing. And it's really, as Gillian said, has become like family. And we very much look forward to listening to members of our family speaking to us this afternoon. Needless to say, we share many problems, the same issues. We have similar solutions, but then because of regional differences, there are also different solutions. And there are different nuances and different ways that everybody around the world is looking at the problem. So it's really, really exciting to be able to listen to everybody. One of those friends of long standing is Julia Graham. Now, Julia is a regular visitor and has been to South Africa for many, many years. Julia and I have met in various places, from London to literally to Venice to Boston and everywhere in between. She's currently the Deputy CEO and Technical Director of EMIC, the UK Association of Insurance and Risk Managers, our sister body in the UK. She has a background in international insurance, enterprise risk management and compliance, and with 4 decades of experience in a global insurance company and a global law firm. She obviously started there when she was still in primary school. Julia is an independent non-executive director at 4 captive insurance companies, including one in South Africa. I won't mention who, but she understands what we do and how we do it. She's a former chair of FIRMA, the Federation of European Risk Management Associations, and also a board member of IFRIMA, the international federation hosting this afternoon session. She recently accepted a role as a Crown representative for the UK Government Cabinet Office, focusing on risk and insurance. So we are really privileged to have her. In her spare time, she has a passion for fast cars, slow men, and Formula One motor racing as a spectator. Julia, with that introduction, it's my pleasure to hand over to you to take us through your experiences in the UK.
Thank you very much indeed, Gerd. I'm going to, first of all, thank you for inviting me to take part today. I would stress when I talked about the fast cars that the fast cars are definitely from the grandstand for Formula One, but I can be seen travelling around the lanes of the UK when I have the chance in my own car, and I've always been a great motor racing fan. So. But I'm a risk taker, probably, than risk averse, which perhaps explains where I'm coming from today. So I'm just going to share some slides with you, which I want to use today. And I'm just making sure that I can get these onto the screen and share those with you. So wish me luck. Okay, does that look okay to my friends at UMSA? They're all on mute, so I'm assuming
Yes, Julia, good. Thank you. Good. We can see it, yes.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. So I'm just going to walk through a few ideas and thoughts that have occurred to us at EMIC during the last 6 incredibly challenging and even with all those years of experience that Gareth kindly referred to, a situation that is unique in my experience in the profession and in the industry. A very strange and challenging time continues, and I've never lived through a crisis of such longevity. You know, in my experience, a crisis happens, and it's the crisis stage of an event is usually dealt with fairly quickly, and some form of recovery then starts. But for many organisations across the world, and including here in the UK, we are actually still in the stage of crisis as we watch to see what next will happen with the pandemic and where it will next rear its head when you think it's gone away. So it is, in many respects, a very curious time. I'm going to look at what we thought was keeping people awake at night before COVID-19, then take a look at what we think has changed since COVID-19, a little bit about how why have some organisations, some countries done very well, and to give a perspective on that, and then to pick up a couple of case studies about people returning to work, and particularly in an office environment. And then a little focus on what's happening in the insurance industry here, because London is still one of the leading insurance centres of the world. So I'm going to share a little bit about that, and really setting up, I hope, the scene for a good Q&A session later on. So Um, the first slide I want to share with you came out of a report that we did earlier in 2020. We conducted a survey of our members at the end of February and the beginning of March. And one of the questions we asked people is a question I've seen asked by organisations before very successfully, and it's often called the risk game. And rather than ask people to give us long lists of the top 10 things that keep you awake, instead, we asked people to say, what headline would you really not want to wake up to tomorrow when you open the newspaper? And why we ask that question is what we find is that it often reveals things that are not in people's risk registers. And what we're looking for in this are what are the issues? You know, we've got fantastic lists of risks, and for many of us, we have and we should keep preparing those. But what we're getting at here is what are the issues that the risk professional needs to take to the boardroom table? Because in my experience, most boards get bored very quickly by going through long lists of risks. And therefore, what I prefer to do with a board is to ask them to look at the big ticket issues. You know, what are the 3 or 4 things that we should really be focusing on in addition to all the things that are in our risk register? And so what you see in front of you is an extract from what some of the people we surveyed said to us. It was just at the time that the coronavirus was starting to take effect. But most of these things in front of us are what were keeping people awake at night before the virus really took the hold that it subsequently went on to do. And the reason I think this is quite useful is, of course, while the virus has been there, all these other things are still there. But the interesting issue is that their profile has been changed by the virus. So we still worry about cyber attacks on industrial systems, but those cyber attacks, the profile and opportunities of those in a COVID environment are a little bit different. Cyber attacks of people working in offices are a little bit different to the cyber attacks and profile that you might have when people are working at home. So what we found a lot of organizations doing are taking those risk registers, all these lists of risks, and overlaying them with the impact of COVID-19. And interestingly, from research that we've done, and particularly research that Aon we've picked up has done, is that if you take the financial crisis in 2008, about 30% of all the risks in a typical risk register were touched by the implications of that financial crisis. Take the same list today of risks and overlay that with COVID-19, that 30% rises to nearer 70%. And it goes some way to explaining why the virus has had such a major impact on the whole of the world. And I think it also helps to look at the virus that way rather than trying to just analyze it purely as a risk. Look at the impact and the impact of the profile of other risks that COVID-19 can have. So it's a useful exercise to do, and I think it would be quite interesting to rerun that with the benefit of the last 6 months. Now, a survey, just to show that I'm even-handed and not favouring Aon, a survey that Marsh produced a couple of months ago looked at what are the risks of most concern in the current environment that we're in today. So this was very much in the context of having now experienced the position of COVID-19. And the type of risks and the profile of risks have clearly changed at a strategic level. And now people are worrying about the financial impact and particularly potential of a prolonged recession on global economies. People are worried about bankruptcies and a wave of industry consolidations. And you can read the list as you go down that many of the risks are quite similar. But again, overlaying that profile of similar risks with the impact of COVID-19 really changes the way that you need to look at risk, and it changes the context in which you're managing risk. And I'll come back to that in a moment. And I guess number 7 there is something we are all worried about, another global outbreak and a double hit of what the effect of that might be on our world. So we are still, to a certain extent, I think, in crises. So going on to what worked well, you know, we've looked at the things that might keep us awake at night, but who did well, which countries did well, which businesses did well. And we've come up with a distillation of 5 pointers, which we think led to some doing better than others. Organisations and indeed countries, and I include countries here who did well, had fantastic communication. They put their people first. They didn't try and recover everything, but they really analysed on what mattered the most to them. And the last two, this is certainly not in an order of importance. I saved the best till last because the two that we believe have got the biggest impact are being agile and with great leadership. So the days of long business continuity or crisis management plans sitting up on a shelf in a grey binder, in my experience, they often seem to be filed away in grey binders, gathering dust, were useless for something like COVID-19, when what was really needed was quick response, quick focus, great thinking, done with agility by the leadership of the business. And this has a profound effect on the risk management community and our profession, because the people who were invited to play in that environment were the people that organisations thought could add value in terms of strategy and leadership. And it will have a major effect, I think, on the future competencies of our profession and what you will need to have to allow you to maintain that position of being able to be a special advisor to your C-suite and the board. So there's a very nice paper actually that's just been published in the last week by McKinsey, and it's an interview with the new Chief Executive Officer of BHP, the mining company. I chose this for a couple of reasons. One, it's not a British company, it's headquartered in Australia. It's an organisation that to some extent has a degree of immunity from COVID-19, and many of its operations across the world, including places like South America, have continued. It's hit on its profits in single figures of percentages, is a lot lower than it has been for many organisations. But they have a new CEO, and I urge you to read the interview with him because I found it quite inspirational in terms of what they treated as a priority. And I read it after I put this slide together, and it reinforces the importance of those 5 issues, and particularly agility and leadership. So going on to the next slide, new normal or next normal. I don't particularly like either of those expressions, but I prefer next normal to new normal. What are we going back to? I think one of the places we started at in AIRMIC when we started to analyse what the world had experienced is that we are not living in a world with an evolutionary change. So many of the things we have in the world, many of the ways that we work, our office approaches are really evolutionary situations from the last industrial revolution. And the way people organise offices, the way that we commute to work, have never really been pushed radically for change. They've just happened and occurred over the last few decades. Changes stimulated by opportunities presented by computerization and technology, but broadly, they are office versions of manufacturing floors that you might see in industry. So when I say new normal or next normal, I'd actually rather say that it's going to be different. It's not going to go back to anything that looks normal in the way that we know it. And one anecdote that I want to take out is the office. So we don't think the office is dead. I do think early on into the experience of COVID-19, many of us thought, yep, that's the end of the way that we work in an office. We're not going back to work. There's no going back. And in fact, one organisation globally has called their response to COVID-19, no going back. And they've said to people, you don't need to go back. If you want to work at home and you want to stay working that way, do it. However, I'm detecting a bit of a change in the way that people think. That office that you see in the picture is an actual office. of an organisation in the UK. And there's been some really interesting reports recently that actually people are getting tired of working at home. The idea of for the first 3 months of working at home was okay to many. If you've got young children, you might not have agreed with that from day one, actually, because it's really difficult to work at home, especially if you're limited in space and you don't have much outdoor space. But only 5% of workers want to work from home in the long term. And they find the inability to stop working and being online, and I imagine many of us who are on this webinar today are looking at ourselves thinking, yep, I know how that feels. A sense of loneliness, distraction, and many negativities of working from home. So particularly if you have limited space and other family responsibilities. There is a concern that there is a disconnection and economic issues of people being distanced from their businesses, transitioning new people who come in and join is a concern. A transition from a rigid to a fluid environment. Many of us have never worked in that environment. What makes us suddenly able to deal with it? And I think also what we need in the future is an environment, therefore, that picks up the best of home working and the fluid environment for some that creates, but marries it to the ability to maybe organize things in a different way. And I think that's very true, that the new working environment has got to be healthier and more flexible. And many of the things that people have been doing to keep healthy while they've been working from home could translate into different organizations in an office environment. So the change has got to be driven. You can't let the change drive you. And it isn't just an evolution of what we do today. It's got to be a redesign and a reboot. And it is a new risk management context. We have not been used to managing risk in that type of environment. So I'm going to mention a couple of things here that we've been seeing in the insurance industry. We surveyed our members. We survey our members quite a bit, actually, and we do a lot of pulse surveys, short, sharp surveys. And earlier this year, we asked our members, what are the things that you want to insure? And many of those issues, they're quite familiar: directors and officers liabilities, cyber attacks, supply chain failures, reputation risks. The problem is, for many, is there's a lack of adequate cover at an affordable premium. Itself is emerging on many risk registers. Now, again, in my years of experience, I've never seen that before. I've always thought of insurance as a control, and I've not seen it emerge on risk registers as a risk in its own right. And particularly on issues like directors and officers, where you may well need that cover to attract and retain the best caliber of directors that you feel you need. That's a real concern. And D&O cover is almost becoming unattainable for many businesses across the globe. One of the other things we were seeing at the time we last surveyed our members were exclusions coming in for COVID-19, even in the middle of existing policy covers. Great concerns about policy renewals and driving many of the larger organisations towards alternatives like their captives. People did think the insurance industry were embracing more innovation, and particularly insurtech, but there was a distinct view that a lot more could be done. And I think at AIRMIC, one of our challenges, I think, to the insurance industry is you've got to do better. We feel that behaviours of insurers and brokers has not been the best, even before COVID-19, but especially linked to COVID-19. Late renewals, changed renewals, not great communication, take it or leave it attitudes, withdrawing some covers and some sectors altogether, meaning that the partnership that had been developed between risk professionals and the insurance market was under serious threat and challenge. You know, at the end of the day, the insurance business is built on the foundation of trust. And I do think that there is damage to trust at the moment in the insurance industry. And that damage has been worsened by some of the experiences that people have had in dealing with insurance after COVID-19. But on a more positive note, what are the things that have happened? Well, I do think people are a lot more aware of insurance than perhaps they were, sometimes not for a great reason, when your insurer tells you that actually you think you might have cover for pandemic, but actually you don't. And there is an action in the UK courts involving our regulator, the Financial Conduct Authority, and that court case the proceedings have concluded. A number of insurers have taken part, and the judgment is awaited potentially in the middle of September. Because some people said enough is enough. The insurance industry is not covering this when we think it should. And this action was lobbied, and in my experience, is unique. However, on a slightly more positive point, the industry is also coming together to try and think about the future, understandably, perhaps with an initial focus on pandemics. Pandemic Re, or the Pandemic Reinsurance Company, could well be a solution which is government-backed, providing businesses with an alternative solution to buy insurance related to pandemic when the insurance market feels it's unable to do so. And there is an initiative called Pandemic Re, which is currently focusing on the SME side of business to see what might be done about that. And that initiative is also due to report in September. I put in here a report published recently by Lloyd's of London. You can download this from the Lloyd's website, and I encourage you to do so because it's actually quite a good read. And it shows that Lloyd's, which is often considered as the moral focus, if you like, of the London insurance market, feels it should be taking a leadership position, which many acknowledge and accept. And they've produced some short, medium and long-term solutions that they believe that the industry should be working on. But the important word in this slide is collective. Nobody can deal with any of these issues in isolation. And it's up to consumers, businesses, employers, and wider society generally to accept that there has been a change and to look for solutions to these low probability, high impact risks that we are now facing. COVID today may be a catastrophic cyber event tomorrow, and very few insurance companies are fully geared up to be dealing with that on their own. So now, just before I close, a couple of things. What are we doing about this? What's the effect of all of that context on our profession? Well, we produced a competency framework for risk management professionals earlier this year. We published it on the 10th of March when we published a report on what we thought the future of the profession was going to look like. It will come as no great surprise. It might to our technical and research manager at AIRMIC, if he's listening today, that we're going to have to update these in the very near future, because already less than 6 months on, these need a rethink. What do we think the future is going to look like? Well, I actually think it's going to look like this slide that I showed before. These are the skills that the risk professional is going to have. The technical skills, whether you deal with risk, insurance, or both, or facets of those, it's a given that technically you should know what you're talking about. But what the modern risk professional is going to have is much more by way of strategic and leadership capability. And if you're going to operate at that sort of level inside your organization, then it means that the type of competencies that you need to reflect that. And so we're thinking very hard about what the profession is going to look like. We know it's going to change. We know we have to up our game. And if we really do want to be the leaders and we want to develop our position within our organizations and to add value to them, then we need new skill sets, new tools, new techniques to do that. And many of the tools and techniques that we have today, although many of them are still relevant, many of them are also going to need updating and refining. And we're going to need new capabilities, new skills that many risk professionals currently don't have. And whether that's in understanding analytics and data more effectively, or displaying those leadership skills, probably a menu of all of them. So I want to finish on a couple of big questions, and you might want to sort of come back to those when we have our panel. Much of what we're doing now, we need to be reflective on in our countries and in our organisations to be sure that what we do to deal with the pandemic is not going to be regretted at some future point. So come back to the point that what we do has to be designed and driven so that what we have is better. And as we reflect on the risks, how could governments, private sector, and individuals collaborate with each other to make sure that we all own and take responsibility for improving national resilience? Because that, after all, is what we are all trying to achieve. So a couple of questions as well as answers. Thank you very much for inviting me here today. My little opportunity to put in a very brief plug here for AIRMIC. We have moved our physical conference that was planned in Scotland in June to be a 3-day online festival in September. Anyone who's a risk manager, come and join us for free. We'd love to see you there. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Julia. Well thought out, well presented. Really some excellent food for thought. I can just confirm your plug. I looked at the program of the AIRMIC Fest, and there's some really interesting topics that will be discussed, and I'm happy to confirm that I've already registered, and I will be attending most of the stuff online, and also a lot of it will be available afterwards. Once you've registered, you can actually check it out afterwards.
Just to confirm that, 6 months, you'll be able to go back and access everything. If you register, it's there until 2021.
Brilliant. There were quite a few things that Julia touched on that we will obviously discuss afterwards during the question session. The one that I have to mention is the Global Security Consultancy Control Risks, which are headquartered in London, but are present around the world, including a couple of offices in South Africa. Looked at the top risks facing business and countries around the world, and their number one risk is lack of leadership, whether it applies to a company or a country. So it's quite interesting. Ladies and gentlemen, if you move your mouse, you will see at the bottom of your screen appears a Q&A block, like 2 of those bubbles. If you have any questions for any of the panelists, put it in the Q&A bubbles at the bottom. The columns will come up when you click on it, and then I will make sure that I address it to the appropriate speaker. Our next speaker is Mary Roth. Now, Mary is the CEO of RIMS, the Risk Management Society in the US. I've been attending the RIMS conferences in the US on a very regular basis since the middle 1990s. And there have been many, many changes, but the one constant throughout that time until now is Mary. Mary's always been the first person on the stage in the plenary session, and she's always been the last one to leave. So it's a massive privilege for me to welcome Mary Roth to our session today. Very short bio says that she's an experienced chief executive officer with a demonstrated history of working in the non-profit organization management industry. She's skilled in non-profit organizations, budgeting, enterprise risk management, and property and casualty insurance. With that, then, I'm happy to hand over to you, Mary. It looks like you are actually in your office in New York.
No, I'm actually not. So greetings from New Jersey on the northeast coast of the United States. And I have this background up because I don't think you all want to see the condition of my home office. No, it doesn't look that bad, but I thought I'd put a neutral background up out there in case someone walks behind me. But I want to thank the leadership of IRMSA for inviting me to join you and the risk management community for this important global dialogue. Working together, exchanging information and best practices is so important to advancing the risk management profession globally. And RIMS couldn't be more proud to participate. As Julia mentioned, 2020 has been an adventure. Countries around the world are at different stages of battling this global pandemic. And in the United States, we're in the midst of it, and the process to slow it down has been complicated. For starters, individual states govern how their territories manage COVID-19. The geography of the country and how spread out it is has presented an issue as well. Some states are just now peaking, while places like New York and New Jersey have so far done a good job of flattening the curve. Political divisiveness has been another issue. When leadership disagrees, it sends confusing messages to the public. So here we are today. If you look at the struggles to contain the virus in the United States, it's very similar to the deficiencies in some organizations' risk management capabilities. The state structure invites a siloed approach to managing risk. I think Robert Cartwright Jr., RIM's former president, will touch on this a bit more as he has operations in different jurisdictions. We often talk about enterprise risk management and the importance of a collaborative approach to managing organizational risks. Well, we're just not seeing it in an optimal way as a country. And then there is communication. Communication is key to managing any crisis. It needs to be clear and it needs to be delivered effectively. And right now, our state, federal, and local leadership often disagree on the virus, its severity, and mitigation strategies. It's hard to find the good in a global pandemic, but if there is one, it would be the lessons we learn. At its inception, we had some short-term issues to resolve. RIMS experienced many of the same short-term and immediate challenges that other organizations did. Adapting quickly to a remote work environment was probably the first. We had to protect our employees and help ensure continued productivity. We needed to verify that they had the tools, technology, capability, and that security measures were in place to support the remote workforce. We also had to address our products and services. Topping that list was our globally recognized annual conference that Gert alluded to. The decision to cancel RIM's 2020 annual conference and exhibition was one of the most difficult decisions in my career. And I've been with RIMS for 35 years, and that's why Gert said he's been seeing me since the 1990s. And there was fallout from it. On May 3 to 6, we were scheduled to host 10,000 risk management professionals, 400 exhibitors and their teams, hundreds of speakers in Denver, Colorado. We were contracted with close to 40 hotels, the convention center, keynote speakers, buses, airports, restaurants, event spaces, catering, and many other vendors. We quickly had to move to address those contracts and work with our insurance broker on event cancellation. We impacted a whole ecosystem that in Denver from an economic perspective as well. But those were short-term issues. When the dust settled, we had to turn our attention to the future. How are we going to move forward and continue to generate revenue and deliver value to members? And I think that's what a lot of our organizations are facing. The shift from short-term objectives to long-term strategy has been the biggest change in the region since the beginning of the pandemic. We recognize that there will be a reassessment of all business models and a deeper look at what can be done virtually and what needs to be done in person. RIMS is looking at the future of events. When government allows us to reconvene, we'll have to implement social distancing measures, food service, room capacities, cleaning protocols, and there is also the personal aspect of this. When will people be ready to travel and meet? It goes beyond events. The pandemic has caused many to suffer from anxiety. With employees at home, there is no longer that separation between personal lives and business lives, and of course, health concerns, not just for our employees and members, but their dependents too. As we shift gears with our business strategies, we need to rethink risk management frameworks and methodologies too. We can't afford to be complacent. We must always look for ways to improve our organizations, our programs, and ourselves. Throughout this pandemic, risk professionals and risk management capabilities have been thrust into the limelight. The profession has become essential to organizational resiliency, to recovery efforts, but also to the future of the organization. We are being called on to support new initiatives and new strategies to prepare for life after COVID-19. And Julia, referenced many of these things in her presentation, and clearly articulated what we are facing as a global community. Unfortunately, it takes time for a crisis. It takes a crisis for this to happen. But hopefully, as we move forward, more resources will be allocated to risk management, and we'll receive more invites to C-suite and board discussions. RIM's president, Laura Langone, who was the head of insurance operations at Airbnb, struck a task force to look at this. So to the question, is risk management in boardrooms? Anecdotally, the answer is maybe, but we're just not seeing it at the level of maturity it needs to be at. We believe this is a huge opportunity for risk professionals, and the task force is working with others to determine how to capitalize on it. Its focus is twofold: to develop a path for risk professionals to ascend to the board level, and we'll look at the skills, training, and opportunities that need to get there. And then the second part would be to enhance the risk management knowledge of current board of directors. This pandemic continues to cause significant challenges for so many organizations, but it has also presented a platform for risk professionals to demonstrate their value. Some organizations rose to the challenge. They implemented strategies, quick thinking, and ingenuity to address change. And let's talk about some of those success factors. Those organizations were forward-looking, not just looking ahead, but also had the ability and willingness to pivot efforts to compensate for change. Different industries were presented with different challenges: shifting to online stores or virtual services, rerouting and assessing supply chains, evaluating resources and the availability of those resources. That is just half of the equation. Recovery also requires that you're ready to shift processes back once it's an option, or continue down a new path. They recognized recovery speeds. Not everyone recovers at the same speed. Departments will recover differently as well. Industries like tech and healthcare are primed to not only recover from the pandemic, but will have the opportunity to advance and generate even greater returns. Restaurant chains and companies in the travel industry might not be so resilient. As risk professionals, it's important to identify and inform others about these potential variances, and when possible, provide guidance as the organization returns to normalcy or a new normalcy. These organizations adapted based on their geography. This next point can be considered part B of the previous. Not only will industries and departments recover at different rates, geography also has an impact. Population density will contribute to this, as will government regulation and intervention. Some countries enforce strict penalties for disobeying curfews and stay-at-home mandates, and we saw factories and facilities in remote locations recover quicker than those in the center of major cities. These organizations empowered local leaders, and what I mean by that is leadership has a holistic vantage point and will determine how the enterprise approaches uncertainty. Operations managers on the front lines will have the best understanding of the on-the-ground status of the situation, as well as the community's needs and preferences. For this to work, communication channels must exist. The better, more accessible, and more understandable the communications are, the more productive the organization can be. Successful organizations have been flexible, and I think Julia hammered this point home. This really is about allocating resources and talent. At RIMS, we have employees who generally work solely on events, now assisting data management or supporting the development of digital products. Risk professionals must be in sync with human resources. If the company were to change an individual's job responsibility, that employee has to be properly trained and safety measures need to be in place. There is a huge risk of losing talent. To keep your people, you must be flexible. These successful organizations were optimistic and prepared. Just like you prepare for negative changes, what if things get better quickly? Are you prepared to revert back? The challenge with a global pandemic is that as fast as it infects entire communities, cities, and countries, the outbreak can dissipate. Unfortunately, we're not seeing that so much right now. Each new virus is impossible to forecast. We always talk about being proactive, but when managing a crisis, it is even more crucial that plans are developed far in advance. The most challenging thing for organizations to work on during a crisis is their crisis plan. And finally, they are anticipating new habits. Global pandemics can and will change habits. Handshaking has long been an accepted greeting in many business cultures. Are we still going to do that post COVID-19? Post crisis or following a world changing event like the one we're experiencing will affect consumer habits. Organizations should expect this and be proactive about it. Online grocery shopping is a great example. At the height of the pandemic, we became comfortable with this technology. We got comfortable ordering, picking up, into the delivery process. We got a glimpse of the convenience it offers. Will this become the new way to shop for food? If it does, how would grocers prepare? Are they equipped digitally? Do they have the delivery capabilities and the personnel in place to meet demands? Another habit is remote working. We're all, Julia discussed, are we going back into the office? Are more people going to be remote working, for the long term? After months of having employees work from home, will companies consider reopening or owning or renting physical office space? Perhaps a physical location in a major city isn't needed, or maybe the organization can manage with a smaller space. We're experiencing that now in New York City. Organizations are looking at their space. Now, there's a flip side. With all this social distancing, a lot of companies need more space. So there's kind of that pro and con for the situation. While it's early to say what habits will become a new part of our way of living and working, there's a real opportunity for organizations to anticipate correctly. So we're always looking at what's the next best thing. What will be the next risk that we need to prepare for? For the foreseeable future, many of the risks on the horizon are going to be COVID related. COVID workplace litigation, especially in the United States, will most likely become an issue. We had a lot of essential workers on the front lines during the pandemic. Medical workers, police, firefighters, but also grocery store clerks, utility workers, and even insurance specialists. Their health and safety were jeopardized, and we can expect to see some lawsuits. Workers' compensation claims and how claims resulting from the COVID pandemic and future pandemics will be addressed. Cyber will remain a priority. With more products online and a larger remote workforce, we are bound to see a new wave of cyber threats. Business interruption, especially as it relates to insurance coverage. Will there be an insurance product for pandemic risk? How available and affordable will it be? If it's not available, will risk professionals be poised to explore alternative risk transfer and self-insurance options? RIMS has publicly supported PRIA, which is the Pandemic Risk and Insurance Act, and it's similar to TRIA for terrorism. And that's a federal backstop for insurance companies that would allow them to confidently write coverage for future business interruption due to global viruses. However, it's appearing more and more that PRIA may not pass. So RIMS is working with leaders in the insurance industry, as well as with other associations and members of the US Congress, to ensure risk professionals' voices are heard and considered in the creation of future pandemic bills. This will be a key component of our Advocacy Week in September, which will, of course, be virtual. So now is the time for organizations to assess their products and services and adjust to the current environment, anticipate for the future. To support the organization, risk professionals must challenge themselves to elevate the profession and its capabilities to the highest levels of their organization and position it as an indispensable and essential business function for all businesses. Must have to successfully support strategic development and implementation and ensure business resiliency. And I think that kind of falls in line with Julia's comments about we need to kind of take out our competencies for risk professionals. I wholeheartedly agree 100% and look at those as we look to the future for this profession. And I think, we're all sitting here today as representatives of FREMA member organizations. And I think that organization and the community that we've established will allow us to come together as some of the questions that Julia alluded to at the end of her presentation, to really address some of these challenges for a global resilient community. So I thank you so much for allowing me to share my thoughts. I know we have one of our former presidents coming up next, and I look forward to our panel a little bit later. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mary. Once again, some really good food for thought. I made so many notes for both as a result of both yours and Julia's presentations that, and the summary may last longer than the speech, but I'll make sure that I have just the main things. But there's so many things that we can take out of this. And one of them is the whole issue that Julia also mentioned with her reference to the pool, what is it, the pandemic pool or pool re, and you with Priya. I wonder what our own government and our own insurance colleagues will do. And, one of the things that I think we all experience is that gap between ourselves and our insurance providers. It's really a problem for all of us. But one of the specialists in insurance that will share his knowledge with us is Frank Baron. And I'm trying to get there you go. Frank's been the Group General Manager, Risk Management and Insurance for International SOS since September 2011. They are the world's leading medical and travel security services providers. Frank's based normally in Singapore. I think currently you're on the coast of France. Frank, you can tell us. Previously, he was in charge of business development for risk consulting activities within the AXA Corporate Solutions Group. As you may know, today AXA XL is the world's largest insurance company. He was also Vice President Global Insurance and Risk Management for Firmenich, which is the world leader in fragrance and flavor industry in Geneva and Switzerland. And he worked in Princeton in the USA for them as well. He's the founding chairman of PARIMA, that's the Pan-Asia Risk and Insurance Management Association. And he's a regular lecturer on courses on risk management topics around the Asian area. He holds a political sciences master, a management master, as well as a risk management master degree. And he's an associate in risk management, the ARM qualification, as well as the European Fellow in Applied Risk Management. He was the European Risk Manager of the Year in 2007. Frank, we really look forward to listening to you and learn some more lessons from you. Tell us, are you in France or in Singapore at the moment?
Thank you very much, Gert, and thank you very much for inviting me. Yes, I'm actually in France right now. So Mary told you that she's based on the east coast of the USA, the east coast of Atlantic Ocean. I'm actually on the other side of the ocean, on the west coast of France. So that I guess the good thing about the COVID-19, I can spend some time with my family and enjoying my family house on the ocean. It's going to be challenging to me to give you some food for thought after the one done by Mary and Julia, but I'm going to do my best. I'm going to start first by telling you that I would like to share with you something that happened to me as a risk manager, head of risk for International SOS. International SOS is the leading medical and security services company, and we have about 5,200 medical professionals in 94 countries. So you can imagine that they have been at the forefront of this sanitary crisis thing since the very beginning of it. And I would like officially leveraging on this event to warmly thank all of them for all the efforts, all the extra miles they did and they are still doing to help people and communities around the world. I just want to mention two individuals which I think are of relevance to our talk today. The very first one is a French doctor called Philippe Klein. Philippe Klein is leading the International SOS Clinic in Wuhan in China, where we witnessed the very start of this pandemic. And Philippe Klein had the opportunity to leave the country, but opted out and decided to stay in order to help people. And Philippe is actually still there, so I'm extremely proud to be one of his colleagues when I witness this type of behaviors. The other colleague I would like to mention is somebody who is based on the African continent. And is the Dr. Amara Allison, who, by the way, has been the one who discovered the very first COVID-19 case out of Nigeria. So as you can see in our organization, this crisis, as very relevantly described by Julia, is has been a crisis to be managed for us as a company, but also being also trying to help others to manage the crisis itself. A few things that I would like to share with you in terms of what this crisis means to us. So we mentioned the longevity of this crisis, but I think it's also a total crisis, as it just hit the world as a whole. I mean, even during the periods of world wars, we had neutral or non-aligned countries that had escaped the conflict. With a crisis such as this one, there is no place to hide. The virus is everywhere, to various degrees, but it's everywhere. The coronavirus crisis is as much due to the dangerousness of the disease as to the organized degradation of the health system. And I just want to highlight, to give you a few pointers to highlight the degradation of this health system, because I think it should resonate in South Africa, in the rest of Africa, but also in other continents. If you look at the United States, the 7.9 beds per 1,000 inhabitants recorded in 1970 has been reduced to 2.8 in 2016. So according to the WHO, the World Health Organization, Italy was also a very impacted country out of Europe, had 922 beds for serious cases per 1,000 inhabitants in 80. This 920 beds compares now to 275, 35 years later, with obviously an increased population. So everywhere the watchword was reduce costs, but the new coronavirus has the merit of reminding us of the obvious. We don't pay firemen simply to go to the fire. We want them present and ready in their barracks, even when they are just bringing up their truck while waiting for the siren. And I think that's something that we should all have to keep in mind. The economic system also has shown throughout its history an extraordinary capacity to absorb the increasingly frequent shocks generated by what we can qualify as irrationality, but at the expense of depletion of natural resources and also the social protection institutions that can cushion the crisis. So the current healthcare system ignores both the explosion of emergency room visits, a consequence of the development of medical deserts in both rural and urban areas, and also the development of chronic diseases. It ignores the return of infectious epidemics, despite several warnings in recent years. And this is maybe for me one of the most puzzling aspects of this crisis. We had tangible alarms the tangible alarms have not been lacking. I mean, the influenza viruses such as H5N1 in 97, H1N1 in 2009, coronaviruses such as the SARS in 2003, and the Middle East respiratory syndrome in 2012. I mean, this is our track record, and these were things that we should all consider while being caught by surprise by this COVID-19 thing. The irony of the situation lies in the fact that the least affected territories, or some of the least affected territories, are China's immediate neighbors, so such as Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Macau. I mean, scalded by the SARS episode in 2003 and aware of the epidemic risk, they immediately implemented the necessary measures to reduce it, namely health checks at the entrances, mass screening, isolation of patients, and quarantine for potential contaminated persons, generalized use of masks, etc., etc. Things which makes really sense, and we are really extremely efficient to deal with this situation, but unfortunately, which are still lacking or have been delayed as a priority in other regions of the world. So COVID-19 has its origin in an increasing interpretation of the human and the animal worlds, which is favorable to the circulation of viruses. So this transformation is itself the result of the collapse of ecosystems, which leads animals carrying communicable diseases to settle close to human settlements. In addition to satisfying real needs, an alternative economic logic will therefore have to restore and respect environmental balances, something that I would like to talk about later on. So that's for me also a key aspect of this crisis. So the risk of infection is a powerful reminder of the interdependence between individuals. This is the whole paradox of the current confinement in countries where it's still there. Isolated in their own homes, individuals have never worked so hard to restore the collective. And the health of each individual is no longer, as in the case of cardiovascular or degenerative disease, the consequence of individual behavior. It depends on the responsibility of each individual towards the collective, and conversely, on the collective's capacity to take care of the health of its least members. So the specificity of the viruses that this pandemic reminds us of is that we do not recognize any social or political border, no barrier. No wall will durably protect societies from the risk of contagion from a cluster ready to swarm. So the coronavirus illustrates the human cost of neglect in the face of a perfectly identified danger. Fatality cannot conceal the obvious. Prevention is better than cure. And this is something that resonates to all the risk practitioners listening to this webinar today. The current procrastination in the fight against the global warming could lead to much more dramatic phenomena by revealing the vulnerability of our civilization, the fragilities associated with the model of globalized economic growth. Will COVID-19 cause a salutary electroshock to the system and to our societies? That's a question mark. And before becoming a health issue, the multiplication of pathogenic viruses also refers to an ecological issue. The hold of human activities on nature. The endless exploitation of new land is upsetting the balance of the wide world, while the concentration of animals in livestock farms favors epidemics. So there are two fundamental differences for me between COVID-19 and climate change, which is the other topic I wanted to connect the presentation to. One lies in the possibilities of regulating the shock suffered, and the other in our capacity to adapt to it. So the self-regulation of epidemics by the acquisition of collective immunity does not make the COVID-19 an existential threat to humanity. That's the good thing, which has already overcome the plague, the cholera, or Spanish flu in otherwise difficult sanitary conditions, by the way. With a case fatality rate probably less than 1%, much lower than other infections, the virus does not threaten the world's population with extinction. On the contrary, inaction on climate change will take us out of the systemic regulatory mechanisms, leading to major and irreversible damage. So that is for me, we can expect a succession of various shocks, increasingly strong and increasingly close together. Heat waves, drought, floods, cyclones, emerging diseases. And the NatCat season, natural catastrophe season we are going through as we watch it in India or during the hurricane season in USA should remind us of this. Risk management has been too much focused on process and compliance at the expense of risk agility and business reality. So as highlighted by the PARIMA risk competency framework, the profile of risk professional must be based on their ability to support entrepreneurial thinking coupled with organizational resilience. So including low frequency, high severity risk scenario, but also enhance risk agility, adapting quickly to a new risk landscape, and support to concrete risk strategy actions, business continuity planning, disaster recovery, and crisis management. So I do echo what Julia and Mary said about revamping or updating the competencies that risk managers should showcase in light of what's happening right now. Things have changed, and this should imply a full reset also of the way we are managing the risk governance, the risk reporting to the C-suite and executive committees. Strategic risk management and an holistic scanning of risk should be a fundamental pillar to their operational and strategic thinking, as well as to their decision making. So when we think of, for instance, supply chain, we tend to think first of traditional physical risk. So representing Asia Pac today, let me refer to the Thai flood we witnessed in 2011 in Bangkok, in the basin of Bangkok, triggered by the tropical storm Nokten, where was a devastating example of failure for a long list of global supply chain businesses. Have we seen evidence of companies, big and small, making sure that there isn't a repeat triggered by flooding incidents of this nature? If I take this example, unfortunately, my answer is going to be no. Business decision making should be more concretely coupled to risk management. What is going to happen to companies who went for, let's say, highly leveraged and debt-funded acquisition in 2019? What is going to happen to organizations that rely on one country or region for their entire supply chain? This is a wake-up call to start building the resilient organization of the future. Organization that will survive pandemics and rebuild their businesses on stronger foundations. And I think it's a key aspect. How the new post-pandemic landscape will look like. The deepest reception in 100 years is highlighting the prime importance of sustainability and resiliency. It is more than a buzzword and should be the cornerstone of every business. Whether it is financial, so having a robust balance sheet built from healthy margins and prudent financial management and strong capital, whether it is social, businesses that look after their people and society at large during this crisis, whether it is environmental, more than 4 million people die every year globally from air pollution, which also makes people more susceptible to COVID-19, by the way. Whether it is strategic, need for clarity around your purpose as a company, your raison d'etre, your differentiators, and the means and drive to deliver it. So the crisis can become an opportunity to redefine the terms of our economic landscape with a better adequacy between shareholders and employees, sustainable capitalists and financial speculators and investors, by guaranteeing the major rebalancing towards the long term and reinvestment in the protection of the planet, the relocation of strategic industries, and the realigned regulation. Here again, I would like to insist on the long-term vision of it, which has been, I think, one of the most challenging advocacy rendered by risk managers, how to make sure that we have a long-term dimension in looking at things in organization. From a broader political risks perspective, the second biggest issue of 2020 after COVID-19 seems to be the deterioration of the globalization and the increase of populism. This has triggered tariff and in some cases outright bans. What else can risk management do to look in the crystal ball and second guess some of this increasing complexity? Well, a sanitary crisis coupled with an economic one and a geopolitical one is I think, already kind of a very strong challenge. If I picked up another, let's say, risk scenario that Julia mentioned in her presentation, which is a major cyber attack or cyber criminal situation, then here we go. We go trying to deal with a perfect storm, which is going to be extremely difficult for organizations to cope with. So here is for me one of the most pressing risk management challenges, the accumulation of risk and the loss of focus on pre-existing ones, because COVID-19 should not be an excuse to, let's say, underestimate the importance of pre-existing risk. I'm conscious of time, so I'm not going to enter all the details that I plan to do, but I will do it during the panel conversation. I do echo what Julia and Mary said about the insurance industry. We have witnessed countless examples of the hardening market over the last 12 months, which has had a huge impact on corporate buyers, large and small, by the way. And Asia Pac does not differ from it. We have the very same thing. So terms are tightening, premiums are increasing, and capacity shrinking at the same time. Insurers are largely adopting what Julia said, a take it or we are prepared to walk away posture. And I think it is extremely damaging to the dialogue and to the business conversation. In some cases, these have been mitigated by increased application of captive solutions and reducing third-party placement, but this is a forced rebalancing and it's far from ideal. So the situation is likely to deteriorate further for customers and perhaps rapidly during the second half of 2020. The impact of COVID is still working through many customer balance sheet, by the way. So the continuing deterioration of the global economy for the next 6 to 12 months is being factored in plans in all boardrooms, and buying decisions will be made accordingly. This being said, the decisions to buy reduced limits, or in some cases no insurance on certain lines of protection, may seem like an attractive short-term saving to some boards, but will have a major impact on corporate risk exposures if taken without proper consideration. Meanwhile, the challenging pricing situation faced by buyers will probably be compounded by further hardening of global markets over the medium term, very likely in most, if not all, corporate lines of business. I would like to echo as well what Mary and Julia said about the insurance industry and the broking industry. I mean, the broking community, for instance, will have very little ability to influence the situation and perhaps in some respects limited incentive to. I think the situation is also exacerbated by the fact that there is an increasingly significant proportion of the brokers and insurers who lack the professional skills and institutional memory to handle our market conversation appropriately with clients. Maybe to, and again, PARIMA as an association is also supporting the need to develop a private and public partnership to develop risk financing tools to cope with catastrophes. There is no time right now for me to enter the details here, but one point which is for me very important when it comes to insurance industry is the fact that I think that it should be also a very strong wake-up call to insurers and brokers about them to improve their own internal efficiencies. I mean, the way insurance is procured, the way the cost structure is developed in organizations such as broker and insurers is just not acceptable and sustainable to all of us. And that's for me a very important aspect of it. I just want to finish by telling you that as governments and businesses refine risk management in a world that feels riskier and more interconnected than ever, focus must be on harnessing the strength of the public and private sectors to allow private risk transfer, as we mentioned, within its capabilities, and provision of public support for the private sectors. Two keys limitations. I mean, the covering of catastrophic levels of correlated losses, and obviously, which is very important to all of us, protecting the most vulnerable who cannot afford to have a private protection. That's for me. Over to you, Gert.
Frank, thank you very much. There's so much for us to take in, and just as well, this session is being recorded because, guys and girls, if you had to take notes like I did, you had to be a shorthand writer. Let me tell you, Frank appears very serious, but he's actually a very funny guy. He's been a visitor to South Africa, and he amused us no end with some of his antics. Another visitor to South Africa is one of my favorite people, our next speaker, Robert Cartwright. Robert Cartwright Jr., CRM BSB OP. He's the Divisional Manager, Environmental Health, Safety and Sustainability at Bridgton. He's a past president of RIMS. He was there in 2018 and also the time when he visited us. And he's currently the chairperson of the Diversity and Inclusion Advisory Council of RIMS. Robert, it's nice to see you again, and I'm very happy to hand over to you for us to listen to your insights.
Fantastic. Thank you, Gert. And it's good to see everyone again. And, I just want to echo with my counterparts and what they spoke about concerning everything that's been going on with this. And between Frank and Mary and Julia, they kind of stole some of the points I wanted to talk about. But I also wanted to kind of bring it back into the reality of what goes on in the everyday life of a risk manager. One of the things that Frank talked about is that the previous experiences should have warned us, and they really should have. We went through a pandemic in 1918 that killed millions of people around the globe, 625,000 here in the United States. And I go back to a comment that a philosopher made, George Santayana, back in 1905. And he said, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. So here we are again. We're in the middle of a global pandemic, dealing with the same situation, some of the things that Julia talked about, and two things that she mentioned about communication and leadership. Those two things kind of tie into what I wanted to talk about, because some of the things that are impacting risk managers, especially here in the U.S., is the daily aspects of life in general. Right now, we're dealing with a situation that is addressing the issues of children being schooled. Back in March, when the entire country almost got shut down entirely and children were pulled out of schools, was a lot of disruption about how they would be educated and what would be the next step of them returning back to school. Not a lot of communication, not a lot of guidance, and so now we're back to trying to send them back to school now in September, and we're running into some of the same issues where the exposure is there, and in some cases they've had to they open up for 2 weeks and had to shut back down again because of the amount of infectious cases that have just risen up behind that. Exacerbating that, a lot of risk managers had to also focus on the fact that if we're going to bring people back to school, what are the school conditions going to be like? In some cases, some schools don't have air conditioning. And so if you're going to bring a child back to school, having them wear a mask and sitting in a classroom when they cannot move around, they have to have the meals brought into them, that creates another situation all by itself. So analyzing all those risks are really inherent of what a risk manager has to do. And I'll step back a little bit by saying this. In a perfect world, risk managers always had the challenge of being heard. And Julia talked about communication. So when a risk manager always communicated in a perfect world when we didn't have this pandemic about issues and problems and things that a company needed to be aware of, there was a lot that had to be done in that level of communication to try to convince others that this was something that needed to be addressed. How much more important that level of communication is now? And I guess the question we need to answer is who's going to listen? As risk managers, we identify other levels of risk associated with COVID-19. Who will listen? And how do we articulate that clearly of the message that needs to be conveyed? So that's just one thought to keep in mind. A second point I wanted to bring up was about essential business guidelines. That was another area that a lot of risk managers had to deal with because if businesses were allowed to be open, you had to worry about supply chain issues of getting your PPE equipment in for the people who were actually working. That was a lot of logistic nightmares, a lot of logistic maneuvering that had to be done. And all those things were factors that created more of an opportunity. And I think, as Mary mentioned, that now it thrust the risk manager right into the forefront of the conversation because now they had to be the problem solvers. They had to be the ones to find the solutions for those issues. And I will tell you that, and Mary touched on that fact too, in the United States of America, and the emphasis United States, because as a country, the states have a lot of governance and they can make decisions for what things need to happen. And if there is an absence of a national guideline, they can create their own guidelines. Well, what that means is if you don't have guidelines from a federal level, now you're going to interpret it 50 different ways. So now you have 50 different interpretations of how something should be done, which doesn't lead to a lot of fluidity to make things happen on a much more cohesive level. So those are the things that we're challenging also for a lot of risk managers here. Overcoming mindsets. Early on, there was a lot of discussion about how this should be handled. And I think that's inherent with any situation. When a risk manager looks at a situation and whatever is facing their organization, they're the ones that will be able to come up with dynamic information, conclusive information, but also collective information that will help an organization to identify what they needed to do next and how they needed to do it. The only problem is that there was a lot of misinformation and a lot of miscommunication, and trying to overcome that as a risk manager became very problematic because even the simple aspect of someone saying wearing a mask to protect yourself became a politicized statement to the point where people were condemned for wearing a mask. But guess what? Back in 1918, it was the exact same situation. People back then did not want to wear a mask. They didn't feel that the government should enforce them to wear a mask. There was a group called the anti-maskers. So history has repeated itself. Here we are now, almost 200 years later, and we're facing the same kind of a mindset. We just had in one of our states, there was a normal gathering where they have a lot of folks on motorcycles, and they will gather in this one particular location. Again, with a COVID situation, most large gatherings really just weren't happening. 250,000 people gathered, and they felt as though that this COVID-19 was just a hoax. It was not anything that's real, and they kind of disregarded it. They were having sneezing contests to see how far a person could sneeze in front of groups of all these people. So now 2 weeks later, they're now tracking someone who had just tested positive. Now they're trying to find out how many people may have been affected by that one person. But that's the mindset. So as a risk manager, when we're introducing information into our organizations about how we need to be preventive, how we need to be careful, how we need to be thinking forward, those are the kind of things that we encounter and they have to try to overcome. The other point I wanted to make about new developments. One of the things that Mary talked about was the fact that with the aspect of COVID-19, people became more resilient and working more remotely from home. And that was a challenge at first because not everyone has the capacity to do that. But they kind of learned to do that. Different platforms popped up between WebEx and Zoom, as we're using Zoom right now. Microsoft Teams and GoToMeetings, and there are so many different platforms that are out there. Then now businesses started to learn how to do that. Risk managers became very creative in saying we can now introduce more information to people without having to travel. And a lot of times what happens in organizations, they weren't allowing their people to travel. So you still had to conduct business. You still had to try to get work done. And that's the best way to do that was through using the virtual technology. But there were challenges with that. Some people weren't aware of how to use that technology. And that technology became problematic because in some cases, you may be having a meeting that someone can hack into. So I think Julia talked about the cyber issues. So there was a lot of things that had to be updated in reference to that as well. That will continue to go forward because I think Julia mentioned in the US that 5% of the people liked working from home, but the majority did not. Back here in the United States is about 45%. And a lot of those people kind of like the idea of working from home, but at the same time, they kind of like the aspect of being social and getting connected with people. So it's a combination of both. I know there are some companies that have said that they will not return their people to an office environment until the end of 2021. So now that creates another aspect of an opportunity for people to understand how to work differently. But again, as risk managers, we have to figure out how to overcome those challenges. Any challenge that comes before us is something that creates an opportunity for us to figure out what the next step is. How do we take that next step? How do we overcome that? The unknown unknowns. Someone said, what was going to be the next issue or next political, the next risk that may come up, the emerging risk that would happen? My thought is that between the social and political changes, that's going to be the next risk that's going to happen. It's going to impact the next steps. Here in the U.S., we're dealing with a presidential election that may change things in the next year or in the next 4 years, depending on the outcome. But it also creates more of a social aspect as well, because now people are being divided. And when you have a divisive environment, it doesn't allow for cohesiveness. And that's an issue, and that's a problem that will be something that we'll have to face here, but it will have global implications. And I think the other thing that one of my counterparts brought up is that we're connected. Everything that we're doing right now is connected. I think Frank made a very interesting point that the ecosystem globally is connected to anything that we do. So if a person has been exposed to pollution, it makes them more susceptible to a respiratory disease, which is where we have COVID-19, which goes back to the global impact of what are we doing with our climate. So there are all those factors that tie into what the next step is going to be. That's a challenge. It's an opportunity. It's also something that a risk manager can now grasp hold of and gather information from as many sources as possible to try to bring up the best answer for their organization. And that's where we kind of missed out on that opportunity of meeting with you folks there in South Africa as we did in 2018, or meeting at the RIMS conference that we missed out in this year, to have the collective group of risk managers meeting together, sharing thoughts, sharing ideas. But guess what, folks? We have technology and we're using it, and we're doing that today as a great example. I think another point that I wanted to bring out was about the government oversight to ensure healthcare compliance. That has become an issue when you look at the fact of the impact of what COVID-19 has done, and it's just affected so many people. The demographics are showing that those who have the least amount of health care are the ones who are most impacted. So how do we as risk managers who are in that field find a way to overcome that. Well, first, and there's a lot of things that are being done in that field, in that step right now, to identify those who are the most acceptable. But again, now that becomes more of a political issue. It becomes a social issue. And if we're not cohesive, and if we're not united in our resolve to try to overcome these things, then we're not going to have a great result. I talked to a friend of mine just yesterday, and we were discussing the whole issue about pandemics. And he says, but we were able to eliminate polio, 50, 60 years ago. We were unable to reduce the amount of exposure to measles or other things like that. I said, but it was a singular approach. When you have a singular approach and everybody's working together, then you get better results. And it's been proven that if there's a global approach to a pandemic, as it was with Ebola back about 7, 8 years ago, then you will have a global impact and you'll have a global result. And we don't see that just yet. So it's going to be really inherent on us to really kind of keep making that as a topic of conversation and making our companies aware of the fact that we need to take that next step. That's going to take a lot. It's going to take a lot of change, but that's going to be the only way that we'll see an end result to this. It cannot be a race for a country to come up with a vaccine to sell it to others. That can't be the end result. It has to be something where it's going to be an effective vaccine that everyone will want to take as a result of that. The last thing I wanted to emphasize was the fact that COVID-19 has exposed a lot of things that were inherent, especially here in this country. And one of the things that was happening prior to was that there was a very big push for everything related to getting folks into the C-suite to create more of a diverse talent. RIMS did a study last year, the talent, there's a RIMS 2025 talent survey, and that study really asked questions of CEOs and universities and academia people around the country of what it was that they were looking for, especially for the next level of talent. And a lot of them felt that diversity was the issue because there's a diverse group of people who they're teaching. They see that from a business model, it is much more profitable to have a diverse group of people around you because now you have different thoughts, different mindsets, and different ideas to take you to the next level. Most companies are globally connected anyway. So the idea of learning about diversity, inclusion, and equity, that became a very big issue. In the first quarter, about 4% of companies were really looking at that. In the second quarter, that went up to 40%. They were discussing more and more about D&I priorities, and especially so because of the unfortunate death of George Floyd here in the United States, who was murdered on live TV. And as a result of that, it became a very, very broad social issue. And that's going to be the next thing that's going to be happening, especially here in this country. And so there's a movement, there's a lot of social activity behind that. You may have been seeing and reading about protests and some of the things that have been happening here in the United States. But I will tell you that, and the reality is that this is very comparable to the civil rights movement back in the 60s. And for the people who had lived through that, and I have a lot of relatives and a lot of friends who I've talked to about this, and they said, this is different. This has much more, it has much more energy to it. It has much more robustness to it. And so that goes back to when we say, how do we get more risk managers into the C-suite? Well, there's a lot of risk managers who are not able to make that next step, only because of the fact that they're not able to move beyond some of the barriers that exist due to their race or their gender or their orientation. And so as a result of that, we're trying to level that playing field. And I'm very pleased to chair the RIMS D&I Advisory Council to kind of help the board of directors and Mary and her staff take those next steps as we try to find more and create that talent pipeline. Because guess what? There's a lot of talent that is out there. We just haven't tapped into it yet. So I'm just going to end by concluding my thoughts. I appreciate being here, Gert, for your moderating this panel. Jillian and the rest of the IRMSA group. Really would love to have been back in South Africa again to see you folks. But I think the idea is that we are really connected. And I learned one thing from your conference back in 2018, connecting the dots. I did appropriate that slogan. I've been using that as I've been talking to other people because it really is about connecting the dots, is it not? We have to connect ourselves globally in order to learn and be able to solve the issues that are going on. COVID-19 is not going to go away. There's going to be things that are going to be moving forward with that. It may be a year or two before we see some resolution, even if there's a vaccine, because some people don't want to take a vaccine. That's all well and good. But the fact remains is that we still need to navigate through all of this. And as risk managers, let's come together, let's learn from each other, and let's not repeat the mistake that others have made before. We don't have to repeat them. We can learn from them and we can benefit, and we'll do that collectively. So I thank you all. It's a pleasure to be back to see you all. And Gert, I'll turn it back over to you.
Robert, thank you very much once again for those words of wisdom that you shared with us. Some excellent points that I've made notes of. Ladies and gentlemen, I see there are quite a number of questions coming through. At the bottom of your screen, the Q&A session, please pose your questions there. Sorry, it will assist me to make sure that we don't miss them and that we deal with them properly. One of the problems that I think we have as a risk management community is that we've been focused just on one particular kind of risk to the exclusion of others. And we've heard from Robert and also from Frank before him that we need to look a lot wider. We need to have a holistic view of risk and risk assessment. One of the people that's able to tell us a little bit more about that because of her background is the previous IRMSA president, Berenice Francis. She's the Motus Corporate Affairs Executive. She's been doing this since 2018, and prior to this, she was the Group Commercial Executive for Imperial Holdings Limited. She was also the Chief Risk Officer for the State IT Agency, Head of Enterprise Risk, and Acting Head of Internal Audit for the City of Johannesburg. She's also held a number of non-executive positions in National Treasury, the Department of Communications, as well as their related SOEs. She's the representative director on Ukamba Holdings, and she's also an independent non-executive director of Altron Limited. Berenice, it's nice seeing you again. We are fortunate that we are able to see and listen to Berenice on a regular basis. So with that, then over to you, Berenice.
Thanks, Gert. I feel very privileged to be following all our great speakers and the thoughts that they had. I don't have specific slides because I wanted it to really be a bit of a conversation. Many of us are familiar with what's happening in South Africa. And I thought, it's a good time, as Robert says and as Frank says, to say, look, what's happening today is about the decisions we made in the past. And COVID is very much dependent on the vulnerabilities we had. We're almost getting to a point where the whole emperor has no clothes situation. So I was in my role in Motus, I'm fortunate enough as well that we've got operations across Asia, we've got Australian operations, UK operations, rest of Africa and South Africa. And what was interesting for us as we were watching COVID unfolding was how different territories handled different things, what they were allowed to do, how the governments responded, and how they had to be resilient despite their market conditions changing. In the South African context, we already were vulnerable. Prior to the pandemic, we were already in a situation where we were going into a recession. We had a downgrade that was imminent. The structure of our companies and our public sector encourages SA that is geared towards a high dependence on people, and particularly unskilled and semi-skilled labor. And then we also had, for many years, invested in what we believe our growth industries are, to move from what we would call a heavy industrial industries and manufacturing to services industries like tourism and financial services. So what happens then when you have COVID on top of that? With the onset of the pandemic, we had a number of discussions regarding what was the global and the South African value chain. We knew that our industries were interconnected, but every industry was treated differently in South Africa. We found that with the initial response, it was a government response to say, we are going to prioritize and therefore give very clear direction regarding this lockdown. And I must admit, as a risk officer, I was a little unprepared. I mean, I don't know if you should admit that or not, but I did not expect the lockdown to be that deep and that wide. We knew that we had to do something drastic, and it was a shock to the system. But the reality of not being able to operate, losing your license to operate, was a shock to many industries. And this created a bit of a mini crisis because you had a lot of industries that were standing still in terms of revenue generation. And that then exposed a lot in terms of their financial abilities to sustain themselves. We also then found we needed a lot more access to and increased need to data, and system integration was key. So the idea that you have silos, we had to break them down very fast. So we had this rapid acceleration of breaking down internal barriers. But linked to that was the concern around security of networks, around communication, and also having a very clear idea of what your stakeholders expected. And not just we thought of as our normal stakeholders, like our investor communities, our bankers, but also very much our people. And we almost turned around our view of who's the priority stakeholder. And I think the idea that Julia spoke about our people was so important that we understood where their mindsets were and ensuring that they felt safe and that they felt that they could trust leadership to make the right decision. What has now changed prior to COVID, and how do we get out of it? So hopefully you've got my IMSA background, but I'm actually back at the office. Our operations after the initial lockdown was allowed to go back under level 4. We have, a dealership footprint across South Africa, and we had to ramp up certain production levels, and certain offices had to be made available. So linked to that was the ability to self-fund our operations. So again, companies that came out better, that came out a little more resilient were the ones who had some buffers. The ability to self-fund not just the operations, but also some of the additional capex and operational requirements. One of the things that we all had to do was redirect spend. And I know that it's a big topic right now, and it's a big topic in the public sector, but the private sector also had to really re-gear where we spend our money. We had to look at very specific operational resilience areas like our people, our processes, and our systems. And ultimately, the key message that we picked up was, where you started was important. So if you already were vulnerable, if your balance sheet was already at breaking point in terms of your working capital management, your ability to absorb and your industry's ability to absorb the new world or the new context that you were operating in was immediately compromised. And so what have we also seen? We've seen that how quickly we make decisions and implement new things. So the ability to be agile was quite important. The realignment of organizations. What became clear was, big central organizations took a bit longer to maybe respond, and we quickly had to re-empower people, make sure that you can practically give decision-making and discretionary power where we on the cold face of operations. And that ability to adapt your value chain was actually something that you needed to understand in terms of your business model. So not everyone could do that fast. Then the level of system integration and security that we needed was also quite important. If I think about the impact on IMSA and what we want to do for our members, we also had to say, how does this feed in terms of the different industries that we had? So the one thing that we did pick up is that our industries were very much dependent on the relationship with government and government's understanding of how the broader South Africa works. We also needed to make sure that the frameworks that we had are adaptable. And I think that's what's nice about having the frameworks implemented as an adaptive framework. The world that we live in, and when we think about the next outlier, is extremely a little bit of a competitive and a suspicious world. The emphasis around being globally connected, both from a commerce perspective, from a communication perspective, and from a travel perspective, really exposed the system that Frank speaks about. You know, we have a very chaotic natural system. And as much as we evolve as humans, there's a response that comes from the organisms we share in our ecosystem. And I do think that when we sit back and try and absorb what COVID means for us, we really need to say, well, there will be the next pandemic, right? What's important is around how we're going to respond to that and how we're going to learn from the lessons that we had. The one big thing that's a little different, if I think about the crises we've had in the past, was the level of media and the level of sharing of information. So it was an opportunity to actually share and be more connected, but sometimes we used the media to really shape our sentiment and our perception. And I don't always think that it was optimized or used for good. So it caused a lot of anxiety and fear without necessarily an underpin of actual information and understanding of what the unintended consequences were in our roles. So when I, if I were to look at key lessons and things that we've reflected on over the last couple of weeks that we've been back, we've really clearly stated that there is no blueprint. Julia spoke about not just what risk professionals will need, but also I think what leaders will need. There's no step-by-step instruction. What's very important is that you need to, and especially in a digital world, and a lot of discussion is now happening around, will we be replaced by artificial intelligence and at what level? And it was a big topic, prior COVID. But what's also important is that as professionals, I think you need to say that you use your theory and your experience as foundation. And whilst you can focus on the data and you focus on the tech, you need to really be able to merge both that theory and the experience and then apply it to a tougher world. Because what we're seeing is that it's getting a lot harder to do business. It's getting a lot more, not just competitive, but people are becoming a lot more suspicious and they're questioning a lot more. If I look at the South African market and the outlook that we have, we started off and we're currently living, and again, if you look at and you listen to what Robert said about our past, in South Africa, we have structural inequality. There's unintended consequences and misunderstandings of what happens on the ground. We had, I think, a reasonably good response in the beginning from our leadership. We had a very cohesive view about, okay, this is what we're doing. And then somewhere along the line, we went a bit haywire. But it was because, I believe, the misunderstanding of what's really happening and what's really needed. We also have, going forward, what I believe is a philosophical contradiction. We had a very different approach in the public sector versus the private sector. And I speak to colleagues in both areas, and it was very clear that the private sector, because of their need to earn, because of their need to create value and support themselves, were very keen on trying to find a way of working through COVID, whereas I think in the public sector, the inability to sometimes work through data, work through access, actually hindered what was happening in terms of the intent versus what actually manifested. So a prime example of that would be, say, in our industry, where we obviously were in lockdown for 8 weeks, so we could not sell a product. We were not allowed to sell a product. We were not allowed to deliver product. But when we were allowed to do so, we weren't allowed then. It took about 3 to 4 weeks before the public sector was able to register cars, for example. So there was this lag effect is almost creating a bit of an own goal for South Africa. So we need to find a way of creating faster cohesion. What's also coming out now is that fortune favors the haves. So if you already have access to digital capabilities, if you have access to information, if you have access to capital, it immediately puts you in a better stead than the people or the industries that don't. And that covers everyone from whether you go to school, whether you go to university, whether you're in business or not. And so there is the risk that this inequality that we have just widens. Taking a big step back in the South African context, I actually went back to our risk intelligence report that was issued this year. Our profile isn't different, you know. The COVID was an opportunity to a certain extent to create social cohesion. We, at a point in time, had a very similar aligned goal, but it can't cement, you know, it can't cover the risk profile that we've highlighted for the number of years at URMSA. We've spoken about our risk profile requiring ethical and visionary leadership. We spoke about the issues around governance failures, and we spoke about there's a distinct failure to root out corruption. All that COVID's done is highlighted it, and what we're now dealing with is a lot of the same issues coming home to roost. So we need to go back and fix the root causes of our issues before we can even go forward. The overall outlook, and I, to conclude on a couple of final points, was your ability to integrate and adapt as a risk manager or as an industry will ultimately lead to whether you thrive or survive in the next year or two. Our ability to understand what the pain points of industry are, what our ability to understand the pain points of our companies are and our vulnerabilities as risk officers, whether we within the profession or within the companies themselves is quite important. Julia pointed out again that it's not about what happens, it's about managing the impacts. It's about managing how we responded. Have we considered it thoroughly regarding the unintended consequences? Are we able to not just have strategic intent, but then follow through to the different levels of execution? So, as a risk officer or as a leader in business, we are paid not just to think things through, but also to execute and deliver. And sometimes the alignment between thinking and doing needs to be focused on. Then very important also is understanding what decisions need to be made for the future. The immediate reaction with COVID was we focused on short-term, survival, particularly given lockdowns. Then we started looking at medium-term and then longer-term recoveries. So the look at every point of your decision-making as a risk officer needs to also be focused on as our role in companies, because ultimately the decisions we help make and we help influence will actually guide our realities of tomorrow. And the last point regarding what COVID means for us is that, everything we do adds to our filter of how we see the world. Living through 2020, we need to know how that will influence our filters, how it will influence our decision-making and our experiences, because having lived through this, we know what did and didn't work. And those key points around whether it's communication or leadership or agility needs to be impacted. And I do believe that as the risk officer, our new role should actually be as a chief connector. So touching on Robert's connecting the dots, you need to be able to connect, not just what's happening operationally, but then connect and influence what the CEOs are thinking and what the board is thinking. So to allow them to make those decision making. Thanks, Gert.
Thank you, Berenice. Excellent once again. Ladies and gentlemen, if you have questions, send them through to me in the Q&A panel at the bottom of your screen. What I will do is we've had some questions that have the same trend, and I will combine some of them and then put them to the panelists. The first one I'd like to put to Frank. Two questions in one, Frank, that David and Riette asked more or less the same thing, saying that they gather that many credible epidemiologists, one of those difficult words, including those at the World Health Organization, believe that the pandemic will last a further 4 to 5 years. One of the factors delaying its eradication is a rising reluctance for people to be vaccinated. Considering that herd immunity requires 60 to 70% participation, and current polls in the US show about 40% only of adults willing to be vaccinated, the longevity of this crisis may be longer than an early breakthrough in vaccines would warrant. Can the risk community assist or take collective action now to overcome this reluctance and possibly misinformation? And then also the future impact of COVID-19, considering this low uptake, not only in the US, but in some other jurisdictions as well. Frank, to you, please.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I mean, the very first thing to remind people of is the fact that in history, any other pandemics lasted about 3 to 4 years with several waves. And is this one going to be different from previous ones? We don't know, but history tells us that 3 to 4 years and a few waves. What do we know also is that the creation and the availability of a vaccine is going to make a difference in terms of the duration of this pandemic and the severity of it. When it comes to what the person said about people being reluctant to get vaccinated, I'm not sure what specific region or country is referring to, but if you look at what we see in Asia or in Europe, for instance, we don't see that. It looks like a lot of people are expecting the vaccine to happen so that we can go back to normal, whatever is the new or the next normal, if I well carefully listen to Julia. So yes, what can we do as a risk management community? I think it's about getting access to the right level of information so that we know what's happening. When you are seeing very misleading information on public access information related to the availability of vaccine or not, coming from China, Russia, and other parts of the world. So getting the right level of information as risk manager is our way to help our respective organizations to make the right decisions. And again, education and communication is the thing to go to. I mean, people need to understand that the vaccine is going to be needed if they want to go back to a certain new or next normal.
Can I add
Thank
something?
you. Yeah, Julia, carry on.
Yeah, I'd just like to add to that excellent response by Frank. And my comment is this. We call it a vaccine, but I think the first thing about communication is that vaccine means lots of different things. So different vaccines can limit damage and help symptoms. A vaccine can prevent illness, but for a limited period of time. And yet other vaccines can eradicate and deliver a cure. So if you compare them to things like polio or HIV, and think of vaccines as in different layers and types, we actually need to work out what we mean by a vaccine before we work out what we want to communicate. You know, I've heard this sort of 4 to 5 year scenario, and from what I hear from other sources, I think that's probably quite realistic. But let's first work out what a vaccine is, because I think it's talked of generically when actually it's not a generic thing.
Good point. The scary thing about the 4 to 5 year scenario is that it will take that long before all of us meet in person again. And we may not be working then. Well, some of us may not. Then Robert, yes.
Yeah,
on the vaccine question.
yeah, just to add to that, I think what Frank and Julia had hit on is also the fact that we need to understand facts. Risk managers cannot speculate so far as what is or what isn't, what will or not. And I think it's going to be really incumbent on us to make sure that we're dealing with the facts and helping people to understand the facts and helping people to isolate what fact is from misinformation. And I think that's going to be the role of a risk manager, that we're going to be able to help our organizations navigate through that because they're hearing a lot of different things from a lot of different sources. You read something or you watch something on one news station that says this, another report says that. So there's a lot of misinformation out there. I think the role of the risk manager is going to be clarity of message, clarity of information, and helping an organization to make calculated, measured decisions. I think that's going to be really important.
Thank you. Robert, while you have the floor, I have an interesting question from Zinat for you, who says that interesting concept of leveling the playing field. What are the steps to do this? Risk managers constantly face the challenge of getting a seat at the C-suite table, whether it is gender-related or just that risk is not seen as important in many organizations.
Yes, that's a very, very good question, and a very cogent point. We talked about this a few years ago, and I think Mary was kind of spearheading the aspect of the risk maturity model, which would help an organization understand where they were in their level of risk. But the value of a risk manager has changed, and sometimes a risk manager is looked at as the naysayer, as the negativity in the organization. You're the person that's always coming up with, well, here we should be doing this, and a lot of times organizations say you're going to cost us more money. In reality, we have to sell ourselves differently. Risk management is really a profit retention aspect of any organization. If you want to add to the bottom line, a risk manager is going to help you to do that. But what some organizations will do is they'll say, well, our retention levels went from 5 million down to 1 million, so therefore we don't need a risk manager anymore. We have to continue to show the value add. So I would say in answer to that question, know the idea of what your culture of your organization is, where do you see the value, and then cross collaborate with others in your organization. Risk management cannot work in a silo. It's got to work, and it's got to be cross collaborative with IT, with HR, with operations, with education, any department. That's how you kind of get your invitation to the C-suite, because then they know you and they know of you, but they also know your value add at the same time.
Excellent answer. Thank you very much. For Berenice, firstly to Berenice, and then I'll go to Mary. Berenice, she says, do you believe that it is possible for us to root out corruption in the public sector as well as the enablers in the private sector?
I'm very optimistic. I'm an optimist by nature. And ultimately, it's about intent. It's about intent and then delivering. So, unfortunately, it starts with our ethical standards and our understanding of what we do have specific legacies. And I find that, having worked in the public sector and been on advisory boards within there, we, as South Africans, we sometimes we spend a lot of time looking at the past without fixing the future or fixing today. So in terms of rooting out corruption, I think inherently there's always going to be room for people who will take advantage. What you've got to do is there's got to be consequences, and you've got to do it fast. You can't wait 2 or 3 years later, because by then it's fundamentally changed your culture, because there's a level of expectation. So do I believe that we can root out corruption? Of course we can. I think we need to be very firm and very clear about what our intent is with regards to corruption. And let me add, it's not just again, the misnomer around the public sector, private sector, etc. I mean, when we were going back, we faced exactly the same type of challenges in the private sector regarding procurement as what the public sector did. I was, as I said, because we were on our COVID crisis team, I spearheaded our procurement processes in terms of ensuring that we're ready. Because what we did as a policy in government is we created a structure where we needed specific things in order to retain our license to operate. And so people were desperate to start operating again. And sometimes they took shortcuts. And we saw exactly the same, how can I say, dynamics in the private sector as what the public sector then faced. So things like price gouging, things like conflict of interests, etc. And what we did was maybe not as highlighted, but it would be interesting to see how the private sector then coped, and how they will deal with it in the going future in terms of stakeholder money. So yes, I do think that we need to move on from that. And then I think we just need to have a better ethical tone in general, and then not allow the unintended consequences of where people can take advantage.
Excellent, thank you. Mary, I have a question for you to answer in conjunction with your previous response that I cut you short. Apologies for that. Tabitha says that she found that putting herself through mentoring and coaching has helped her to change her state of mind and also challenge her mindset. How else do you see risk managers or risk practitioners can one change mindsets?
I think Robert alluded to that a little bit earlier, in that, risk managers need to base their decisions and their guidance on fact. And I think, the way to change mindset is to demonstrate to someone a cause and effect, and really being able to articulate that. And going back to communication, communicating with your constituencies within your companies and outside of your companies based on solid facts, and demonstrate it through examples. We did this, and this is the results. And if you can demonstrate those results to the individuals or the people you're trying to influence in a manner in which they can understand it, I think is one of the ways. And it's related to mentoring and coaching, in that you have to have those skill sets to be able to communicate back to the employees in your organization what would be the outcome if they took, if they did X, but base it on facts and results that you've seen, that you can demonstrate to those individuals. I think, it's critical that risk professionals can clearly articulate, can negotiate that, and can really, demonstrate to the people that they're speaking to that if you take these actions, these positive results will come from it. I don't know that there's a magic solution, and maybe other panelists will have that magic solution. But I think, what I wanted to step in earlier was, that goes to not only top down, but from where you're sitting as risk professionals up to the board level. And we do see that as a challenge for a lot of risk professionals. And as I alluded to in my comments earlier, we've established a governance task force with probably 9 key deliverables when it comes to how do we influence and ingrain risk management and solid risk management practices at the C-suite and the board level. And I think that's also, based on facts and demonstrating that value in a manner that they can understand at their level, no matter what level they are within an organization.
Thank you. You had comment to add, Berenice?
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to point out what Mary says as well as what Robert pointed out earlier. That having been a risk officer for many years, what's very important is the culture of your organization. And we must be very clear in understanding what how valued our contribution is and who the audience is. And sometimes it can be very frustrating, but we can't fool ourselves about our impact. My view on careers is that you need to have a very clear view around what you want to achieve in that organization, given the context that you're operating in, and then find a place where you will be valued more. And give yourself those choices, and don't frustrate yourself, because we've got amazing talented risk officers that, if applied in the right environment, will thrive.
Yeah, exactly. A question from Riet for Julia, and it's not only from Riet, it's from all of us, Julia. We all have the same question, especially now. A number of insurers, she says, are talking about the fact that hard market rates will help soften the impact of them for them of COVID-19. Yet very few, if any, have actually paid claims to their insureds. My comments have even admitted that they have liability in terms of the policy. Could you please comment on their behavior? And at the same time, Antonella has asked something similar, and she said the time has come maybe to seriously think about self-insurance. Over to you, Julia.
Okay, thank you for the question. It's a great question, and I'll make a few observations. First of all, at AIRMIC, we're not using the expression hard market, we're using the expression harsh market. And you may feel, well, what's the difference? Well, the difference to us is that hard market, as we used to understand it, was all about price. And it was about relatively short cycles of softening and hardening of price. But actually, the market we're in now is not like that. The market is still in a cycle, but the cycle is much longer. And I think the current market that we're in will last for at least 3 years in total. So we're halfway through that period. And the other things that make it different is that it's not just about price, it's about availability of cover. It's about the application of high deductibles, limits in the amount of cover that you can buy, the withdrawal by some underwriters from certain classes of cover, parts of classes of cover. So, for example, directors and officers liability is normally in what they call Part A, B, and C cover, and there have been reductions in the cover. And very importantly too, some sectors completely no longer wanted, form a queue here and go away, and things like construction come to mind there. So it's got different characteristics, this market. I do think a lot of what we find difficult is down to behaviour as well. So you can put up rates and you can restrict cover, and you can even exit certain types of cover and certain markets. But it's not what you do, it's the way that you do it, as the song goes. And the behaviour of some underwriters has been very poor, and some brokers, by the way. I don't absolve all the brokers as just being good guys. And what we saw with the market when COVID-19 happened is what I call a running to the hills. Don't look at me, this isn't covered. And if it is covered, we're doing our damnedest to make sure it's no longer covered as soon as we possibly can, breaking established agreements included, for example. So I think COVID-19 has given underwriters a further chance and opportunity to keep increasing rates. I think they were largely increasing rates before, not necessarily based on underwriting experience. D&O is largely speculative, based on some experience in the United States and perhaps Australia. But in Europe, it is still an attractive and profitable class of business. And I have got sympathy for underwriters facing a risk that perhaps they didn't mean to include. But I don't absolve them of poor underwriting and poor wordings. And even the same insurer, in some cases has got more than one wording for the same risk. So it is, I think, an excuse to keep the hardening of the market or the harsh market. There aren't many claims that have been accepted. And you're right, Gert, that sometimes it's just that we won't accept the notification. And that's one of the reasons for the Financial Conduct Authority case in the High Courts in the UK, where I think many policyholders thought enough is enough. And they did feel that they were covered, and they did feel that they were entitled at least to have their claims considered, whereas I think the insurance market turned their backs on many of their customers. So I think it's a breach, as I said when I was speaking, there's a big breach of trust going on in the market at the moment. What it is driving people to do is to look at alternatives. And I mentioned D&O. And again, I've been on a captive board for about 15 years now. And certainly when I started, I wouldn't have seen D&O as a natural cover for a captive. But it is increasingly the case. And I know of a number of captives who are now admitting D&O onto their captives, looking for other covers that they might put in their captives, and indeed using their captives much more than they did before COVID-19. So I think the insurance market for larger customers, it's not always possible for smaller customers to do that. But for larger customers, people are seeking alternatives, and captives is one of them. It's not the only one. There are alternative means of capital out there as well, which is cheap at the moment. And I think the insurance industry had better get its act together and sort themselves out, because if they're not careful, I think we've described it as the industry is at a crossroads. Do you want to go forward and be a partner, or do you want to sort of throw the towel in and say this industry is broken? And maybe after 300 years, or if you ask the Italians, 2 centuries or 2 millennia, depends who you think started insurance. Either way, it's a very old and established business. But if the industry is not careful, it will make itself redundant.
Thank you. I'm conscious that we are rapidly running out of time. So I have 2 questions left. There are 2 questions that I will combine again and ask Frank to respond to that. Direct question from Andre saying, what would you suggest to improve the usage of business continuity plans? Zinat says, many predicted that there would be a pandemic, and in fact, infectious diseases featured in the World Economic Forum Global Risk Report. What can we as risk managers do differently or better to help our organizations prepare better for the next big one? So the 2 questions, if I can combine it, Frank, and ask you to answer Andre and Zinat.
Yeah, I mean, business continuity planning, that's, I'm going to go back to what Julia said at the beginning of her address. I mean, it's all about the color of the binder. As long as it's gray, it's not going to be successful. And if it's colorful, then it's going to be successful. Joke aside, we saw it now. I think we have all the evidences that a proper business continuity planning needs to be accepted and used as a day-to-day tool by business and operational leaders. It can't be just seen as something to be done, a compliance exercise, and then you forget about it on your day-to-day, during your day-to-day operation. And that's for me the key point. And it needs to be, forget about the fancy stuff, it needs to be extremely concrete and very actionable. And I don't think that, but then you have different version of it. But my own views about business continuity, it should not be too much, I would say, design based on each and every risk scenario you may think of. It should help overall the organization to be as flexible, agile, and responsive that you can afford as an organization. So it's, I think, more about disruption can happen and how do we cope with it, and to make it as a day-to-day exercise, to make it as a day-to-day tool that people can use, and being extremely concrete about it. That would be my $2 cents type of of advice to people on this one. When it comes to how to address the next big risk, the next big pandemic or Armageddon risk that may happen, I think that it's I would be I would love to get the feedback from the other panelists, by the way, on this one. But for me, it looks like if you address this pandemic risk, let's go back to November 18. We started to have evidences of what was happening in China. We had some pieces of science telling us quite likely this is what is going to happen. You are the risk manager and you address it to your board. Nobody is going to listen to you. Nobody. That is my feeling. And so I think that it's more about now, COVID-19 is a good example. COVID-19 can be leveraged by people to say, 6 months ago, 8 months ago, you would not have listened to me. But now we know that this type of scenarios can happen. So let's make sure our organization is properly risk agile and risk aware so that we can make the proper decision and arbitrage regarding risks so that we can improve the overall resiliency of the organization. And it's more about this for me than saying this is the way we should address it next time. Because unfortunately, I mean, look at today. For me, one of the struggles today, and I can see it with some of the members of PARIMA, is the fact that they have specific mega risk trend impacting them, but because they are not related to COVID-19, they are not listened. And they are not listened also because there is a lot of organizations are under a very strong economic pressure as well. That's for sure. But it's very difficult to entertain different risk scenarios and that can impact an organization for sure.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you, Frank. Last question, and it's addressed specifically to Robert, and I'll combine the two. Do you think that COVID has brought people risk to the fore? And how can we improve D&I in South Africa where we face xenophobia from time to time? I think the two related, the people risk and then also the xenophobia. Please, Robert.
Yes, thank you. A very good question. I think both of them have the same kind of answer to it because if you're dealing with people, there's a risk of either retention and also how you're moving people and how you're addressing them. When you have healthcare issues that are involving that ties in with that as well. So COVID-19 has really impacted the people issue, and that is a risk because what we're seeing is that when you start to have that impact of someone falling ill and maybe in fact infecting others, you have to make sure you have certain programs and policies in place for isolation, for also treatment, and also for how you're going to take care of the folks who are still working. So there's a lot of elements that are tied in with that. I think the second part of the question, just from the D&I standpoint, I think the survey that was, or the report that RIMS did, kind of helps to any risk manager to provide some data. Most companies will only make a decision if it's a data-driven decision. And there's a lot of information in that report that a risk manager can use to highlight that companies are actually looking for this. They're actually looking for the next wave of talent when you're saying we're going to recruit people from this university or from this college. But what are you really looking for? You're looking for persons who are talented and who have expertise and risk. Well, if I only look in the same talent pool of the people that I golf with, for example, I'm only going to get the people who golf with me, and I'm only going to get that level of experience. But if I really want to broaden my horizons, I want to kind of look outside of that. And any organization, two things are about: growth and sustainability. So if we're trying to grow and we're trying to be sustainable, the 21st century version of a risk management or a risk organization or any organization is to be diverse. It's been proven, it's been established, it's a monetized scenario, and there are information and there are graphs and data that will prove to any company, CEO, whoever you want to talk to, that it is an established fact. A diverse organization is a much more profitable organization. So I would utilize that information. It goes back to what we said before. Risk managers have to have knowledge. They have to have information. They have to have data so that they can introduce any thoughts and ideas into their organization.
Thank you. We can continue with this conversation probably for the next hour and a half. So firstly, allow me to thank the panelists for your contribution. Firstly, your very well prepared introductory remarks and being so kind to answer the questions. And as you say, some of them were really good questions. You always know when a politician was stumped when he gets asked a question, and the first thing he says is, "That was a very good question." It just gives him time to think. Very brief summary. Julia highlighted a few things for us I think we should remember. Number one, that all the risks you had before are still there. Although COVID-19 is a major issue, those have not disappeared. She also said, and a few of the panelists also reminded us, we need to look and see what worked well before. And Julia highlighted communication, prioritizing people, identifying what matters most, and then agility and leadership. There are many other points that are very important. The other one that I think we should remember is that the competency framework we thought we had for risk managers, we absolutely need to review and revise. Mary highlighted the fact that often the country reflects the company, and there are different approaches around the world, and even within countries like in the US, there are many different approaches. She also highlighted a number of lessons that were learned, but I think the one that stood out for me is that communication is critical. Better communications mean better organizations. Then also she mentioned that plans are very important and that you have to have plans in place before. What will be the next big thing? She highlighted a few, including litigation around COVID. I think that's a given for South Africa as well. Cyber risks, and we just saw the big issue of what would you call it, leaking of information, critical information of people and their bank details yesterday in South Africa. And then business interruption coverage. Frank had a number of very important points. He also said that we knew about pandemics. Why did we not see this particular one coming? He also highlighted two important points about, firstly, the interaction between animals and humans and the migration of viruses from animals to humans. And at the same, or in the same breath, saying that individual health is no longer the responsibility of that individual only, but it's a responsibility of the collective. He also pointed out very eloquently the link between climate change and the situation which we find ourselves in, including the COVID-19. Robert had a number of important points, again also highlighting that previous experience should have warned us. He spoke about the issue in overcoming mindsets are difficult that may be, and about the unknowns, specifically the socio-political changes that will face us quite soon. He also mentioned that to get the risk managers into the C-suite, we have to overcome barriers, many of them, different kinds, and we have to level the playing field. Berenice mentioned the more resilient an organization is, the better they are able to survive. And it's not only financial, but also people, processes, systems, etc. It's the ability to absorb the shocks. Also, very important was the level of integration and the fact that our frameworks need to be adaptable. She also pointed out a number of very important lessons learned, but I think the one that I personally remember is that the risk manager should be the chief connector in an organization. Just as well, this was recorded because there's so many important points that I don't think we all remembered. Gillian says that the exam on this particular thing takes place next Friday. And with that bombshell, over to you, Gillian.
Thank you. Okay, there we go. Thank you, Kat. Yes. So if you can all be prepared for that exam next week, we'll be ready to go. No, but seriously, thank you so much for today to Kat, Julia, Mary, Robert, Frank, Berenice. What a fantastic afternoon. I agree with Kat. I think this is something we could have discussed much longer. And I know that there's so many questions, and I'm just listening to all the facts and all the information that you shared, and just so pertinent to what we're going through at the moment and will be going through on this landscape. So a huge thank you to each of you for really coming through and joining us today. It is just always fantastic to be able to spend time with our global partners. And so to each of you, thank you. I'd like to thank LexisNexis again just for really making this possible for us today. So Mary, Robert, Julia, and Frank, I really hope that we'll be able to see you at our conference coming up. I think we're going to be having very exciting discussions similar to this, and maybe you'll be able to participate in some of those discussions as well, because I think after today, our members are most definitely going to want to maybe hear a little bit more from you. So it'll be really great if you are able to. So maybe we can talk about that. And then I promise, before I run over time, because I know that we just decided to let the panel go on a little bit longer because the questions were so good and the discussions were so great. So, but before we close, I know that we promised a free ticket to our conference coming up at the end of September to our most active and most popular social media tweet this afternoon. So before I share who the winner is, don't you want to take a look at this and see what we've got in store for you with our conference? Thank you so much. So with that, and you can see quite an exciting session that we're going to be having. Really, really looking forward to it. It's going to be totally different from anything that we've experienced so far. So I think as our events team get prepared for our first online conference, it's been super fun for them. But really looking forward to the great content that we're going to be sharing. But now to share our winner of our social media contest today is Patrick T. Chalke. So Patrick, our team will be in touch with you, but congratulations, you're going to be joining us at our conference. So we look forward to seeing you there. And with that, I will close. And just, I know both Kat and I, we were speaking a little bit earlier that today it was indeed like seeing our family in the room again with our global partners. And Mary and Robert, we hope that we'll be seeing you in Chicago at the RIMS conference next year in April, May. And then, of course, Frank, So sad we won't be seeing you in Singapore later in this year, but hopefully next year there'll be an opportunity for us to be there in the East with you, with Karima. And then, of course, Julia, to be up in the UK with you sometime with AMIC as well. So we really look forward to seeing that day that we will be in the room together. We know that we've all got a way to go, and please, all of you, so all of our global partners, our members that joined us today, please continue to keep safe. You know, the risk is still high as we try and get into normal life, particularly in South Africa as we've gone into our lockdown 2, phase 2. Keep safe, and I look forward to seeing you all soon. Thank you.